It's extremely important for India that our tariffs be brought down quickly. Longer term, I think we, should calculate on being part of a necessary strategic alliance that the US needs if it is going to go head to head with China down the line. I would love Indian industry to have the attitude they had in the early 2000s, where they thought they could beat the world. We need to come together, keeping open the possibility that the US may come back and be a much more eager partner down the line.
Hello and welcome to Tracking Trump on DeKoder as we look at the India-US trade war on a day when China and the United States have dialed back some of their trade tensions, but not entirely. What will the impact of the China-US agreement be on India and the rest of the world? And what could the next year or two look like? Because it looks like Trump's weaponization of tariffs as a tool in diplomacy, in dealing with other economies is here to stay. So this is not just something that's going to go away anytime soon. As far as the India-US trade agreement is concerned, we know that talks are underway and President Trump has made perhaps his most positive comments in recent times on it by saying that there will be a trade deal with India. The question is, what kind of a deal will this be? How will it be something that would be win-win for both sides? And what is it that India's economy needs to do to be resilient throughout all of this uncertainty? We're happy to have with us one of the leading economists and voices on this. Raghuram Rajan, the former RBI governor, joins us straight from the United States. Thank you, Mr. Rajan, for joining us on DeKoder. I just want to dive straight in with, President Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping, which has seen him announce a 10% reduction in tariffs on China, which is now 47% as opposed to 57%. And importantly, China has said it's no longer going to have these export controls on rare earth minerals, something which had really put a lot of panic in industries all over the world. But that's only for a year. How do you look at this thaw in the US-China relationship?
I think the right word is thaw. It's a détente. And in this year, we're going to see both sides do their level best to reduce the dependencies, the key dependencies on the other. For the US, certainly it's an issue of how do we get alternative supplies of rare earth minerals. And some of what the discussions in Asia, certainly with Australia and so on, is finding alternative sources of these materials and to speed up investment in them so that the US can be more independent. For China, of course, part of what they need is high-speed chips for the AI that they're doing. They don't want that interrupted to the extent possible. And so some of this will be about trying to ensure those supplies. And also that there's no creeping sort of protectionism because via the Trump administration preventing U.S. Businesses from doing business with a variety of Chinese businesses. So both sides are pulling back. But I think the pullback is temporary while they build their defenses. And the key issue is how often does the eruption happen going forward over what issues? Because clearly, with the kind of testing that's going on both sides, the eruptions will keep happening. Perhaps not on the issues that have already been settled for the year, but new issues will come up.
It's also interesting that even just before he headed into this meeting with President Xi, Donald Trump announced that the US is going to resume nuclear testing after a gap of, I think, 3 decades, which is a very significant announcement to make, which I suppose would add a new sort of dimension to the US-China relationship and tensions with China. And how do you see then this uncertainty impacting India? Because now in terms of tariffs, we have the highest tariffs at 50% slapped on us. China's now at 47%. And what does all of this then potentially mean for us in the year ahead?
Well, it certainly is a very big issue for India for certain industries, textiles, for example, where already we probably are losing the festival season in the US, the Christmas shopping, Thanksgiving shopping. We've probably been stymied there unless some of the exports took place ahead of time. But going forward, what we don't want is the supply chains we've built up and that we've integrated into to be permanently disrupted. Some of our textile manufacturers are, selling to the big U.S. stores, big U.S. chains. And if that gets disrupted and they find new sources of supply, it may be harder to recover those. So it's extremely important for India that our tariffs be brought down quickly, especially in these areas where we have labor intensive industry, which has made a certain amount of headway into the US. What is as important for India is that this not spread. I mean, one of our biggest concerns is not so much the goods tariffs, but if they try and find ways of imposing tariffs on services, this is still a threat. There's the Hires Act, which Congress is debating, which will try and put tariffs on outsourced services. How that'll be implemented is anybody's question. But I think this creeping of tariffs beyond goods to services to Indian visitors into the US through the H-1B route, these are all concerns that while we don't want to prolong the talks, it's important to flag these as concerns, if not now, down the line.
I do want to talk to you about the H1B issue in just a moment, but then looking specifically at the India-US trade talks, which we know are still underway, Trump, as I said in my introduction, made perhaps his most positive comments on that by saying that a trade deal is happening. The question is, what is a win-win trade deal for both sides in this difficult situation?
So, if you look at the pattern of the US administration's negotiation, it's always raised the level of anxiety to a very high level, then bring it down and be able to declare victory on both sides. I think that's certainly what's been happening. I think the win-win. I mean, surely part of the answer is to the extent that we don't benefit that much from Russian oil. And there have been a number of studies which say if Russia can sell it elsewhere, the kind of benefit we get from buying Russian oil is modest. That could be a sort of something on the offering plate saying, look, we're not going to encourage our oil buyers to go to Russia. In fact, some of them have already turned to the US and to other sources. I think that that is something that is an irritant that can be taken off. It's obviously sort of insisting on justice and fairness here is not going to be useful. It's more what is the pragmatic route here. I think the bigger sort of concerns have to do with some of the areas we think are vulnerable, such as agriculture, and to what extent can we accept certain kinds of demands without impairing our agricultural producers, many of whom don't have the kinds of resources and sometimes the subsidies that U.S. farmers have. So how do we sort of balance that in a way that allows for more sort of access to U.S. producers while not impairing the production and the revenues of our own? There may be some areas where we can do deals. So a blanket no is probably not worthwhile, but being very careful about ensuring that where we say yes, we also can help our own producers by offering them certain wins. For example, access to the US market in some areas where we can expand our access. So I think negotiation, given a deep knowledge of where we are good and where the US can be open to suggestion, is very important. I think importantly, short term, we are negotiating from a position of weakness because we do export more goods to the United States than the reverse. Longer term, I think we should calculate on being part of a necessary strategic alliance that the US needs if it is going to go head to head with China down the line. But
If I could
this
interrupt, sorry.
administration is short term in its views.
No, it's interesting you raised that point about the India being a sort of a on the US side to counter China, which has sort of been the general view of things, which is why the Quad came into existence. And today, even the Quad, we don't know what its future is. There seems to be a school of thought that maybe Trump is looking to deal with China in his own way directly. Then the Quad risks becoming more and more irrelevant. And the question is. What does India do in an environment like this where Trump may not want to use India as a counterweight to China?
I think almost surely, first is this administration is relatively short term in some of its actions. It's not thinking beyond what the sort of longer term repercussions are. But it does believe in many ways that when it comes to the longer term, it can sort of come back and say, bygones be bygones, let's deal. And it's sort of everything is transactional, is deal based. And there is a deal to be had in the longer term, given that India has concerns about China on its border. And given that both countries may actually find some common areas of cooperation on the defense side. So I think in this administration's mind in the US, everything can be compartmentalized. Let's do the deal on trade, but let's separate that from the deal on defense, which is down the line. Of course, these two are linked. And I think it's
Right.
important for India to also suggest that there is a link and that, longer term, the US would benefit from the kinds of ties that we promise, as also our defense purchases, etc., and the defense cooperation that we put on the table.
What, according to you, would be, for want of a better word, an acceptable tariff on India in its negotiations with the US? There are some experts here suggesting that anything more than 15% would be difficult for India to handle. Is that what India should be targeting, in your view? Is there a number?
Well, zero would be great, but I think the point is we should not be hampered relative to our competitors. And if you look at most of East Asia and South Asia, the deal that seems to be emerging is 19%.
Yes.
Many of them have come away with that. Now, developed countries, Europe, Japan, have come away with 15%, and Singapore has 10, and a bunch of countries that didn't sort of rouse the US have come away with 10. So anything in that range, 10 to 20, would be great. What is important is that we don't make commitments that are onerous and hard for us to deliver on. I think Japan and the euro area have made commitments on huge investments in which the promise is that many of the returns from that investment will go to the US. I don't see how they will deliver on that without compromising the economies hugely. And maybe they think this is just talk, or they can sort of last while the current administration is in place and renegotiate after. But I don't think it's wise to make those kinds of commitments to get a better deal.
Then, coming to the H-1B visa issue, since you flagged that as something that India should put on the table, even in these negotiations, how do you see the impact of this $100,000 fee in the short term and the long term? I mean, I know that there's a popular school of thought on social media, which shouldn't be a barometer for anything, which says that bring this talent back here, let them contribute to India's economy. Except, where are the jobs in India? Where are they?
Well, we do need to think about what happens when those barriers are put, right? So what matters is the jobs after that. First, let's be clear that over time, the need for H-1B visas for Indian companies has been diminishing because a lot more can be done, through the virtual networks rather than by physical presence. Less is needed. There used to be a time when your programmers had to go and sit in US offices to do their programming. That is obviously much less so today. So, more than H-1B is a question of whether this outsourcing will be tariffed, and that would be a bigger concern there. Um, Also, there are a variety of clarifications that have come, including the fact that existing H-1B will not be disturbed, that Indian students in the US who migrate from a STEM degree, into an H-1B, they won't have to pay that price. So there may be ways that, in fact, Indian companies can still have a bunch of personnel in the US, except that they have to maybe try and recruit more from Indian students who acquire degrees in the US, and use those personnel. But finally, I think it may well be, as you said, that Indian companies decide, I don't really need to send somebody there. Let me hire a couple of people there to do that front end job, but instead I will do much more on the virtual side. I will get a lot more sort of I will get the people here to back up the front end there. So there'll be a certain amount of hiring in the US of people to represent the front end, but a lot more of the back end will get done in India. I think the similarly, when we think about U.S. companies that are hiring, the Microsofts of the world in the U.S. On an H-1B basis, you can imagine that many more of those people will be hired directly in India, but kept in India in their GCCs, and transmitting their work across. So I think there will be adjustment. I think the net effect will be less sort of H-1B immigration into the U.S., but it's not as it doesn't look as bad as it seemed in the first sort of glance. I think the Hires Act is much more important for us.
I think that's very important that you've made that point. As you said, the worry is that Indian services outsourcing, if that gets tariffed, then I mean, we're really in trouble. I remember you said, when all of this started, that Trump's tariffs are a wake up call for India not to be dependent on any single country, and you made the point that this is an opportunity for India to unleash reforms that would then allow us to achieve that 8.5% growth. Can I ask you whether you think we have thought about whether India has really thought about that at all? I mean, I know the IMF says that India's growth this year will be a little bit better than they had earlier anticipated, but they do expect it to be not so, not as good in the next financial year, keeping in mind the impact of the tariffs. So, do you see any roadmap that's really coming out of India to address this issue of structural reform that's needed that you were talking about?
I think, well, certainly the GST reforms were, to the extent they were prompted by some of this, was also a good place, a good action to streamline GST. Of course, we now have three slabs, right? But it was a step forward. I think the bigger question is, all those reforms which we are suggesting to make doing business in India easier. We need to accelerate those. I remember a committee being set up, not in the last budget, but the budget before that, to suggest easier ways of doing business. The chief economic advisor was very positive about doing that kind of action. I think that needs to be brought forward very quickly, and the states have to be brought on board, and there has to be competition among states, which there is some, but to get the best practices from each other and make doing business easier for both our domestic firms as well as any foreign direct investment we get. And part of that is certainly making the taxation system more transparent and less arbitrary sometimes, and less of a I will tax you and then we'll see in the courts for the next 5 years what happens. I think we need to accelerate all that. I think the other place where we really need to take a close look is on the creeping increase in tariffs over time. I thought that discussion with the US would be very valuable because it would not only cause us to look elsewhere, but also cause us to look into our own tariff system and see where we've been increasing tariffs to protect Indian industry. Indian industry doesn't really require protection if we can do the right things to help it on the doing business side. So, I would love Indian industry to have the attitude they had in the early 2000s, where they thought they could beat the world. We need that attitude to come back again because they've been very, very pessimistic and going back to the old license permit Raj, we need protection. That is not an answer in this day and age. We must make new sort of supply chains, and not just through the US, not just to the West, to the East, to Africa, to Australia. These are all places we should explore, and hopefully this is a wake up call to do that.
Well, you mentioned the government setting up a committee a couple of budgets ago, and you do know that the most surefire way to kill something in this country is to set up a committee because then it gets buried for years. But that aside, also, I think the important point you make about bringing states on board, I think for that you also require that sort of political will to reach out to states, the true spirit of federalism and not what we're currently seeing. Finally, Mr. Rajan, how does India navigate a world where, as I said, Trump has decided to clearly weaponize tariffs in diplomacy, in economic trade policy, and this isn't going away. And you saw him. I mean, he didn't like an ad that Canada put out on tariffs with Ronald Reagan's comments from decades ago, and got angry with them and slapped them with tariffs. So you never know what he may wake up to next.
Well, I think the answer is put the politics aside domestically and make the strongest India we can. And that means let's look internally. We have a huge market and it's growing. Certainly in purchasing power parity terms, it's increasing. There are many ways we can increase growth. You talked about jobs. Let's talk about services for the urban areas, which means let's train many more people, not just in high-tech chip design, but also in plumbing, in carpentry, in road work, in masonry. We've got a strong growth in construction. We need much more in terms of affordable housing. So there are many ways we can create jobs, but it also requires an enormous amount of cooperation between the states and the center. And we can't always be looking to stymie growth in states because they happen to be opposition states or because we don't like their current leadership. We need to come together. This is something actually Mark Carney is trying to do in Canada, break down the domestic barriers even more so that it can generate growth. I would think that if we can break down the domestic barriers in India and generate the kind of growth we can, and stop this talk about jobs in Maharashtra for the Maharashtrians. And I mean, we need an integrated market, whether it's a labor market, whether it's a goods market. We need flows across India. That way, we will get protection from the threats of others because we can say, well, we're pretty strong ourselves because we've developed the Indian economy to that extent. So I think there's a lot of possibilities looking internally. Of course, there are a lot of possibilities looking externally also. The US is not the only country in the world. There are others. We can develop relationships. We need to work on both those fronts, keeping open the possibility that the US may come back and be a much more eager partner down the line.
Well, it looks like an India-EU trade agreement may also be happening soon. One with the UK is already done. So let's see where that takes India. But thank you, Raghuram Rajan, for joining us and giving us perspective on what continues to be a very challenging negotiation for India, both economically and politically. Donald Trump, never a dull day with him. Thank you very much. And that's it on the show this week. We'll be back with much more on Tracking Trump next week. Do join us then.